Welcome. The difficulty level of this video is moderate. Today we're going to talk about something called the Human Development Index, which is an index of prosperity by country that is produced for almost all countries in the world and has been produced by the United Nations since about 1975. The exact date of when this began is hard to find because I have seen data going back to 1975, but there are other places where it only shows data back to 1980 and in some cases even only back to 1990. And there are some very interesting possible reasons for this and implications of this, not the least of which is that overall human prosperity as a world aggregate is rising very quickly, perhaps quicker than people in 1975 or 1980 had even anticipated because, they may not have been aware of the accelerating rate of change. But the implications of this are that what the United Nations Human Development Index Committee back in the day defined as countries in their top category, which is high human development, and the cutoff that they had established for that was in fact an absolute cutoff, not a relative cutoff. So they didn't set out to say that only the top 20% or top 30% of countries are high human development. They set an absolute threshold, and while in 1975 only a dozen countries in the world may have been prosperous enough to meet that cutoff, as the world economy grew, more and more countries crossed that threshold, and now the number of countries that qualify as high human development by the standards of 1975 is quite extraordinary. So we're going to explore that in a little bit. Now, to begin, we go to the Wikipedia page for the UN Human Development Index, click on the first image. This is how they divide the world into their four categories of very high, high, medium, and low human development. Now, why are the first two categories very high and high? It relates to what I mentioned before. In the beginning, they only started with high, medium, and low, but then worldwide economic growth pushed so many countries above the high level that they had to divide that into two and have very high versus high, while the medium and low categories began to shrink, although some countries have not been able to advance and continue to stay in the low. So these are just the four categories. Going back to the Wikipedia page, you have more granularity of colors. And you can see the scheme here. Dark green is the highest, then it gets to lighter green, yellow, then orange, deeper orange and red, you get to more and more poverty. And you can tell which regions of the world are the pockets of poverty that still exist. But ultimately, this is the categorization of the index across a lot of different levels. Going back here to the main page, we scroll down, and this is where it gets interesting. You have the annual reports and list of countries by Human Development Index. The report for 2020 shows the data as of 2019. They release a report most years, but not every single year. Usually about a year after the data comes into play. And they rank countries. And don't fixate too much on an individual ranking, plus minus a few slots, because that does fluctuate a fair amount. The most prosperous country in the world is apparently Norway, then followed by Ireland, Switzerland, and so forth. Canada and the United States are lower than they used to be. In the early 2000s, they used to be in the top 2 or 3, both of them. Now down to 16th or 17th. This is questioned quite a bit, and it is alleged that the United Nations Index has decided to prioritize European political priorities ahead of North American ones, things such as carbon footprint per capita and so forth, in which both Canada and the United States are not going to perform very well. I don't quite agree with that myself, since the United States has in fact lowered its carbon footprint per capita quite a bit. But these are the so-called, developed, most advanced countries. And the rankings are not really a surprise to anyone. Now, as you get lower, remember this is the very high human development index category, you can see that all the way down to number 66 is considered very high human development. That includes even countries like Malaysia, Serbia, and Mauritius, and Costa Rica. Then the second category, 67 and lower, is high human development. And that goes all the way down to, amazingly, 119. Countries like Vietnam, Gabon, and Egypt are considered high human development. And this ties back to what I was saying earlier. What was considered a high human development country in 1975 was a threshold only met by maybe a dozen countries, at most 15 to 20. And now 119, which is the majority of the countries in the world, are now high human development. And below that you have medium and lower human development, which are not very large groups. Again, some countries persist in low human development and have not been advancing, but any group above the bottom tier has been improving considerably, and this cutoff rises substantially each year. And it is proof of the accelerating rate of economic progress that you're familiar with if you've watched other videos on this channel or read the Futurist blog. Now, this is very profound in that if you went back in time to 1975 or 1980, and the people who were producing poverty stats at that time, they would almost certainly have been astounded to see that by 2019, the year for which this data was collected, so many countries have pulled themselves out of low and medium human development and gone into high, so much so that they have had to create a category of very high human development. 119 countries are high human development or higher. 66 are very high. And from a 1975 or 1980 perspective, it would seem that a large chunk of world poverty has been outright eliminated. They would never have thought that this much poverty reduction would have occurred because they were not aware of the accelerating rate of change and the accelerating rate of economic growth. Back then, certainly. Even today, most people are not aware. There's perhaps slightly more receptiveness of that. And what that means is this trend is continuing, and I have often said most human poverty will be gone, outside of a few rare pockets and some of the lowest ranking countries on the list, will be gone by the early to mid 2030s. So I mean 2032 to 2035. Most world poverty will be mostly gone as poverty is defined today. Now, the cutoff for poverty continues to rise, but the truth of the matter is even a working class American today would seem very prosperous to Americans of a century ago, or even the 1950s. That is simply a fact. At the bottom of this page, you can see some summary table by region, at least starting from 1990. Ideally, they should have started from 1975, but they're starting from 1990, and you can see how each region has kind of advanced. The world average, as my cursor is at right now, was at 0.601 and now is all the way up to 0.737, and you can compare as to how much that is relative to other regions at a certain time. Now, if you want to play around with the additional data or compare what a certain country was in a certain year relative to what another country is today, and to create an apples to apples association to see how many years behind country A is from country B or any other such comparison. This is the UN website itself, which the link is in the description box. And again, they unfortunately don't go back further than 1990, even though they started the HDI in 1975. You can take whatever country you want and compare. You can see China in 1990 was 0.499, and it rose to a much higher number by the modern era, 0.761. Or you could say that China of 2019 is equal to what South Korea was at a certain earlier year, or that India of 2019 is equal to Brazil of some point in the 1990s. You can do all these types of comparisons, or what the United Kingdom is today is equal to what the United States was some number of years prior. So you can play around with this data. They used to have a very nice graphing metric to look at, but I don't think that exists here anymore on the UN official website. Now, finally, this is very important in looking at the accelerating rate of economic growth. So from there, I'm going to go to this chart, which is from the Our World in Data website, share of world population living in absolute poverty. And this is also featured in my Adam publication, Chapter 9, linked below. If you believe in the accelerating rate of economic growth, which is inseparable from accelerating technological change, and the two are in fact extremely closely related, you can see that world poverty in 1820 was 94% of all humans, and there's no need for the chart to go further back than that because there's no real progress, as we know. And there was a slow improvement, but well into the lifetimes of people alive today, there was still 60% of the people in the world living in poverty, 60% in 1970, down to only 9.6% in 2015 and mid-single digits by 2021. So it took eons upon eons to get to the point that even this 94% started to lower, many millennia of human civilization. Still 60% in 1970, and then just rapid fall. And it's not even so much about changes in geopolitical systems, the fall of the Soviet Union and all that. It is a very smooth parabola because the technological forces and economic forces were working on this problem and are continuing to do so as we speak. And that is why we are down to the vast majority of world poverty under this definition. You know, they define the threshold of world poverty today down to single digits. And that's why I say by the mid 2030s at the latest, probably even a couple years earlier than that, early 2030s, there will be almost no poverty as defined today in the world, just because of these inexorable exponential trends. This process has not stopped, and despite the fact that a large portion of the mainstream media has a business model that depends on making you either angry or frightened, the truth is everyone is more prosperous on average than they were even a few decades ago, and this process is ongoing and accelerating for sure, even if we are told that that is not the case. Believe me when I say, sitting here in 2021, half of all economic growth that ever happened after 1999, and that is even if you use the suboptimal metric of gross domestic product. If you use asset prices, then half of all economic growth has happened after even a much later year, one could say 2010 perhaps. So these are some data points to really ponder and to be more optimistic about, because this accelerating rate of change is ongoing, and the UN Human Development Index, whether it was deliberate or not, they never adjusted up the cutoff for high human development versus medium human development, and the transition of countries out of lower categories into higher ones so that more and more of them are above a certain threshold of absolute poverty really does corroborate all of the data that we see about accelerating economic growth. It is not merely some fantasy of people who are excited about futurism. The data is evident even from sources that did not set out to portray the data this way. Thanks for watching.